The guns were still firing, the drones were still in the air, Ukrainian cities were still burning. And then, within hours, everything changed. A man who launched the deadliest war on European soil since 1945 stood before cameras on May 9, 2026, and said 4 words the world never thought it would hear from him. He said the war is coming to an end. Not a pause, not a ceasefire, the end. And the question you need to stay for, the one nobody is fully answering, is whether he actually means it, or whether this is the most dangerous bluff in modern history. Welcome to a moment history may remember for decades. What you just heard is real, and it is happening right now. On May 9, 2026, Russia's Victory Day, a Trump-brokered 3-day ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine went into effect. 2,000 prisoners are being exchanged. Vladimir Putin told the world the war is coming to an end. And Donald Trump posted on Truth Social claiming credit for one of the most dramatic diplomatic maneuvers of his presidency. But before you get swept away by the headlines, stay with us, because this story has layers that the breaking news alerts are not covering. By the end of this video, we are going to show you exactly what happened and when. We are going to break down why Putin said what he said on this specific day and why that timing is not a coincidence. And we are going to dig into the one detail, confirmed, documented, and largely ignored, that tells you everything about whether this peace is real or whether it is a performance designed to buy Russia time. We cover stories like this before anyone else. Subscribe right now and hit the bell icon, because when this story breaks further, you will want to be the first to know. Let us begin. It happened fast, and the sequence matters. On May 8, 2026, President Donald Trump announced a surprise 3-day ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine war, posting the announcement on Truth Social. The ceasefire, he said, would begin May 9th and run through May 11th, timed to coincide with Russia's Victory Day, the annual commemoration of the Soviet Union's defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. Trump framed it as a symbolic moment for both nations, noting that Ukraine was also a major factor in the Soviet victory in that war. Trump also announced, and this is important, a prisoner exchange. 1,000 prisoners from each side, 2,500 miles of front line, 4 years of brutal combat, and 2,000 human beings coming home. Then came the statement that stopped newsrooms in their tracks. On the morning of May 9th, Putin stood before reporters and said, and these are his words, that he thinks the matter is coming to an end. He was asked about the war. He could have said the ceasefire is promising. He could have said negotiations are progressing. He chose the word end. Zelenskyy confirmed Ukraine's participation in the prisoner exchange on X, directly thanked Trump for his diplomatic involvement, and asked Washington to guarantee that Moscow would follow through. By noon on May 9, the ceasefire had officially begun. The guns, at least officially, fell silent. To understand why this moment is so extraordinary, you need to understand just how impossible it once looked. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022. Putin's military planners initially estimated they could seize Kyiv in 3 days and install a compliant government in a week. That plan failed catastrophically. Ukrainian forces, backed by American intelligence and European weapons, stopped the advance on Kyiv within a month. Russia regrouped, refocused on the eastern Donbas region, and settled into a grinding war of attrition. Over the next 4 years, the conflict consumed hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Russia made slow, painful territorial gains in eastern Ukraine, particularly around Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and parts of Zaporizhia, but never achieved the decisive breakthrough it had hoped for. Meanwhile, Ukraine launched drone strikes deep into Russian territory, hitting oil facilities, military infrastructure, and even the Moscow suburbs. Economically, Russia absorbed Western sanctions better than many predicted, pivoting to China, India, and the Middle East for trade. But the war had become deeply costly. Estimates suggest Russia was losing between 700 and 1,000 soldiers per day by 2025, and its military equipment stockpiles were under significant strain. By the time Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, Both sides had effectively reached strategic exhaustion. Neither could win decisively. Neither wanted to admit it could not win. Trump saw a gap, a diplomatic window, and dispatched Special Envoy Steve Witkoff to shuttle between Kyiv and Moscow. The groundwork for May 9th was laid over more than a year of back-channel pressure, economic leverage, and direct deal-making between Washington and both capitals. This ceasefire did not happen overnight. It was the end result of a war no one could finish, and a diplomat who refused to accept that peace was impossible. You remember the question we opened with: is Putin's statement real, or is it a tactical bluff? Stay with us, because we are about to show you the one piece of evidence that cuts right through the optimism, and it is not good. There are 5 people driving this story, and each of them wants something different. Donald Trump wants a legacy-defining diplomatic win. After years of critics saying his foreign policy was chaotic, brokering an end to the largest European war since World War II would be a transformational achievement. Trump personally requested the ceasefire through direct communications with both leaders. He wants to own this moment.
Vladimir Putin is playing a longer game. At 73 years old, with Russia's economy under pressure and its military stretched across a 1,000-kilometer front, Putin has reasons to want an exit, but only an exit that allows him to claim victory. He has already annexed 4 Ukrainian regions on paper, even though Russia does not fully control them. A ceasefire that locks in those territorial gains, even informally, would let Putin tell the Russian public that the mission succeeded. His signal that the war is coming to an end is calibrated language. It is not a concession. It is a positioning move. Volodymyr Zelenskyy is in the most difficult position of any leader on earth. He is being asked to make peace with the man who ordered the destruction of his country. He has called previous Russian ceasefire proposals traps. Yet he confirmed the prisoner exchange and thanked Trump. That is a significant shift in tone, and it tells you that Zelenskyy, too, understands that exhaustion is real, that support from Western partners has limits, and that 2,000 of his people are coming home. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy, is the undercover architect of this entire process. He has made multiple trips to Moscow and Kiev, building personal relationships with both sides in a way that traditional diplomats could not. His announcement of the prisoner exchange agreement was the first public proof that these talks were producing tangible results. And finally, the soldiers on both sides, the men and women who have been fighting and dying for over 4 years, and who on May 9, 2026, were told to put their weapons down for 72 hours. Their reaction to the ceasefire announcement tells us something about the war that no political statement can capture. For them, 3 days without dying is not a diplomatic milestone. It is survival. Here is where the story gets complicated. The ceasefire began on May 9th, but less than 24 hours before it was announced, Russia launched one of its largest drone and missile barrages in months against Ukrainian cities. Zelenskyy described it publicly as absolute cynicism. Think about that carefully. Russia agreed to a ceasefire while simultaneously preparing to launch a massive attack. The missiles were already in the air when the deal was being finalized. Ukrainian officials reported that Kyiv and several eastern cities were targeted in the hours before the ceasefire window opened. Air defense systems worked to intercept the incoming threats, but damage was reported. Lives were lost. The Victory Day parade in Moscow on May 9 was notably scaled back compared to previous years. Fewer troops, fewer weapons on display. Analysts noted this was likely a reflection of how many resources Russia has committed to the actual war, rather than a symbolic display. The parade grounds were quieter than usual. That detail is telling. On the ground in eastern Ukraine, the front lines on May 9th were largely quiet for the first time in recent memory. Ukrainian soldiers reported that the guns had stopped. Russian soldiers, according to multiple accounts, appeared to follow the ceasefire order. The silence along the contact line, that jagged scar across eastern Ukraine, was eerie and unfamiliar. The prisoner exchange itself is logistically complex. 1,000 soldiers and captured personnel from each side being transferred simultaneously.
These are not just statistics. These are people who have been held in conditions ranging from difficult to brutal. Ukrainian families were gathering at processing centers before dawn, waiting to see if their loved ones were among those coming home. The ground reality is this: the ceasefire is real and observable, but the scars of what happened in the hours before it began are also real. Both things are true at once. Here's the part no one is talking about, and it changes everything about how you should read Putin's peace signal. If you are finding this coverage valuable, subscribe now and hit the bell. We are just getting to the most important part of this story. The world reacted to the ceasefire announcement with something between cautious optimism and deep wariness, and the division fell almost exactly along predictable geopolitical lines. In Washington, the Trump administration was quick to frame the ceasefire as a historic achievement. Officials pointed to the prisoner exchange as proof of concept that direct engagement works, that the America First diplomatic approach can produce results where multilateral frameworks failed. European leaders were more measured. The UK, France, and Germany acknowledged the ceasefire, but issued statements emphasizing that a temporary pause is not the same as a peace deal, and that any lasting agreement must respect Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Europeans are acutely aware that if Ukraine concedes territory under a deal brokered by Washington, it sets a precedent for how great power politics actually resolves conflicts in the 21st century. NATO, which spent 3 years supplying Ukraine with weapons and political cover, is watching nervously. A Trump-brokered bilateral peace agreement, one that may not include formal NATO security guarantees for Ukraine, would effectively sideline the alliance on the most consequential security issue of its generation. China publicly welcomed the ceasefire, calling it a positive step toward peace. Beijing has quietly benefited from the war, buying discounted Russian energy and positioning itself as a neutral broker. But a prolonged conflict also carries risks for Chinese economic interests. A ceasefire is, for now, in Beijing's interest. On social media, the reaction was immediate and polarized. In Ukraine, the prisoner exchange news drove millions of shares and emotional responses. Families publicly posted their hopes of receiving loved ones. In Russia, state media framed the Victory Day ceasefire as proof that Putin had achieved his objectives and was now magnanimously offering peace from a position of strength. In the West, commentators split sharply between those calling it a Trump triumph and those warning that any deal that legitimizes Russian territorial annexations is a capitulation. The global reaction mirrors the complexity of the moment: genuine hope, structural skepticism, and the recognition that this ceasefire is a beginning, not an end. Now, here is what the coverage is largely missing. Putin said he thinks the war is coming to an end. He also said, in the same set of remarks, that he would prefer to speak with former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder when discussing European security matters. Schroeder, not the current European leadership, not the EU, not NATO. Schroeder, a man who sat on the board of Russian state energy company Rosneft, who has maintained close ties with Putin throughout the war, and who represents a channel to Moscow that bypasses the official Western diplomatic structure entirely. That name, Schroeder, buried in the same press briefing as the war is ending statement, tells you something critical about how Putin is thinking about the post-ceasefire architecture. He is not imagining a peace process that runs through Brussels or Strasbourg or the European Council. He is imagining one that runs through informal channels that Russia has historically controlled and manipulated. There is a second hidden layer. Putin explicitly stated that he would only meet with Zelenskyy after a lasting peace deal has already been agreed upon. Read that again. He will sit down with the Ukrainian president, but only after the deal is done. That means Russia will negotiate the peace without Zelenskyy at the table for the substantive decisions. Ukraine's territorial fate may be determined in rooms where Ukraine does not have a direct voice at the critical moments. That is not how a victor negotiates. That is not even how an equal negotiates. That is the structure of an arrangement where the most powerful party sets the terms and presents the lesser party with a framework to accept or reject. Zelenskyy has noticed.
His public acknowledgement of the prisoner exchange was careful and conditional. He confirmed it, he thanked Trump, and he specifically asked the United States to ensure Moscow abides by the agreement. He is threading a needle, accepting the good that this moment offers, while signaling to Washington that Ukraine needs guarantees, not just gestures. The hidden angle is this: the peace process that is taking shape may not be the one Ukraine needs. It may be the one Russia designed. We just told you the part about Schroeder, about what Putin actually said when no one was watching the fine print. But the stakes, what happens to Europe, to the global order, to you, if this goes wrong? That is the next segment, and it is not a comfortable picture. Let us be precise about what is actually at risk here. If this ceasefire holds and a genuine peace process begins, the immediate upside is undeniable. The killing stops. 2,000 people are already coming home. Millions of displaced Ukrainians may eventually return to their cities. European energy markets, which have been distorted for 4 years by the conflict and its sanctions fallout, could begin to stabilize. The United States, which has committed over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine since 2022, could begin to exit an expensive and politically complicated commitment. That is the best case, and it is genuinely good. The likely case is more complicated. A ceasefire holds, but no formal peace agreement is reached for months or years. The front lines freeze. Russia continues to control large portions of eastern and southern Ukraine. The territorial annexations Putin declared in 2022, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, remain in a gray zone, neither formally recognized nor formally rejected. Ukraine is left in a state of armed neutrality, unable to join NATO and unable to fully recover its sovereignty, while Russia rearms and rebuilds for the next decade. The worst case is what European security analysts have been warning about for 2 years: a ceasefire that legitimizes Russia's territorial gains without meaningful security guarantees for Ukraine creates an incentive structure that rewards military aggression. If Russia extracts territory through war and then negotiates a peace that locks in those gains, every authoritarian leader on earth is watching and learning. The precedent set in Ukraine does not stay in Ukraine. NATO's credibility depends on whether its eastern flank, Poland, the Baltic states, Romania, can trust that Article 5 means what it says. A peace deal that bypasses NATO and leaves Ukraine exposed is not just a Ukrainian problem. It is the central question of European security for the next generation. And there is an economic dimension that is under-discussed. Russia's defense industry has been on a war footing for 4 years, producing artillery shells, drones, and missiles at rates that shocked Western analysts. A ceasefire does not halt that production, it just redirects it. A Russia that stops fighting and starts rearming is a Russia that can return to aggression within a decade, better equipped, better tested, and with a clear read on how much the West will actually sacrifice. The stakes, put plainly, are these. This ceasefire could save lives, or it could buy time. Whether it does one or the other depends entirely on what comes next. The analytical community is divided in ways that are instructive. Military analysts who have tracked the front lines closely argue that the ceasefire reflects strategic exhaustion on both sides, more than genuine political will for peace. They point to Russia's continued territorial pressure along the Zaporizhia axis and Ukraine's ongoing drone campaign as evidence that both militaries were still prosecuting the war aggressively, even as diplomats were talking. From this view, the ceasefire is a pause, welcome but fragile. Geopolitical analysts focused on Russian decision-making note that Putin's Victory Day statement is historically significant, regardless of intent. This is a leader who has publicly and repeatedly framed the war as an existential struggle for Russian civilization. For him to acknowledge, even obliquely, that the matter is coming to an end represents a meaningful rhetorical shift. Whether it translates to diplomatic flexibility is a separate question. But the words matter. Ukraine-focused researchers and policy experts are cautioning against premature optimism. They point to the pattern of previous ceasefire attempts. The Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015 are the most prominent examples. which Russia used to rearm and regroup before resuming offensive operations. They argue that without ironclad security guarantees for Ukraine, any ceasefire is a staging ground for the next conflict, not a path to lasting peace. Diplomatic historians are noting something that rarely gets attention. Trump's decision to tie the ceasefire to Victory Day, a day of enormous symbolic weight in Russia, was either brilliant or reckless, depending on your read of Putin. It gave Putin a face-saving frame to announce the ceasefire as something he was doing from strength, not concession. That framing may have been the price of getting Russia to agree, but it also means the Russian public has been told they are winning, not compromising. The experts agree on one thing. The next 72 hours are the most important since February 2022, not because of what happens in the ceasefire window, but because of what signals are sent and received in the negotiations that will define whether this silence lasts. We started with a question, 4 words from the man who started the most devastating war of this century. The matter is coming to an end. Here is what we now know, and it is more complicated than the headlines are showing. The ceasefire is real, the prisoner exchange is happening, and the framework being built around this peace may be exactly what Russia designed. That is not reassuring. That is a warning. Let us talk about what comes next. 3 scenarios, each grounded in what we know. Best case, the 3-day ceasefire holds completely. The prisoner exchange goes smoothly. Within weeks, both sides agree to extend the ceasefire indefinitely. U.S.-mediated talks begin on a formal framework, with Ukraine given binding security guarantees, either from the United States directly or through a reconstituted NATO commitment. Russia agrees to pull back from at least some occupied territory in exchange for sanctions relief. Zelenskyy, facing political pressure from a war-weary population, accepts a negotiated settlement with international guarantees. The war ends. Reconstruction begins. Europe stabilizes. Likely case. The ceasefire holds for 72 hours. It is extended fitfully for another week or 2. Negotiations begin but stall immediately on the core issue, territory. Russia will not relinquish the 4 regions it annexed. Ukraine cannot formally recognize Russian sovereignty over Ukrainian land. Both sides manage the contradiction through deliberate ambiguity, a frozen conflict model similar to Georgia or Cyprus, while both quietly rearm. The war does not officially end. It becomes a cold conflict with periodic eruptions. This is the most probable outcome based on current trajectories. Worst case, the ceasefire collapses within weeks. A disputed incident, a shelling, an accusation, a drone strike attributed to the wrong party is used by one side to justify resuming operations. Russia, having used the pause to consolidate positions and rest its forces, launches a new offensive in late summer 2026. Ukraine, having received reduced Western support during the ceasefire period, is less prepared. The war enters a more dangerous phase, potentially with escalatory pressure on both sides to reach for more extreme options. Watch these 3 indicators in the coming days. Whether the ceasefire holds past May 11, whether direct talks are publicly announced within 72 hours of the ceasefire end, and whether Ukraine receives any concrete security commitment from Washington, not a promise, but a commitment, before agreeing to any extended framework. We want to hear from you. And this is not a formality. This genuinely matters. Here is the question we keep coming back to. Putin says the war is coming to an end, but he also says he will not talk to Zelenskyy until after the deal is made. So who actually negotiates for Ukraine? Does Zelenskyy have real agency in this peace process, or is he being handed a framework and asked to sign it? And here is the second question, which is perhaps even harder. Would you accept an imperfect peace that stops the killing today, even if it meant Ukraine could not fully reclaim its territory and potentially left the door open for Russian aggression again in 10 years? Or do you believe the only durable peace is one built on full Ukrainian sovereignty, no matter how long it takes? These are not easy questions. There are no clean answers. Tell us what you think in the comments. This is the kind of conversation that belongs here, not in a think tank or on a Senate floor. Your perspective on this matters.
3 things you need to carry with you when you leave this video. First, this ceasefire is real, it is happening, and 2,000 human beings are going home because of it. Whatever else is true, that is true. That matters. Second, the peace framework being built around this moment has structural problems that are not being discussed in the breathless headlines. Putin's refusal to talk to Zelenskyy before a deal is done, his preference for informal channels through figures like Schroeder, and Russia's last-minute barrage before the ceasefire window opened are all signals that deserve scrutiny, not silence. Third, the next 72 hours will tell us more about the future of European security than the last 72 weeks. Watch whether this ceasefire holds, watch whether talks are announced, and watch whether Ukraine receives guarantees, real ones, with teeth. This story is not over. In fact, what happens in the next 72 hours could change the trajectory of the war, the shape of European security, and the global precedent for how territorial aggression is resolved in the 21st century. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell, because when it breaks further, we will be the first to cover it, and you will want to be here. This is May 9th, 2026, the day a man who started a war said it might be ending. History will decide whether he was right or whether he was simply once again buying time.